Andries Botha. He will be presenting technology adoption behavior, implications for conversion rate from internal combustion to alternative propulsion systems. Should be interesting. Andries has also been active since yesterday, so he should be familiar to most of you if you didn't already know him. He's a chemical engineer. He qualified at the University of Pretoria. He's got an MBA and a PhD from UP and a master's in management of technology from MIT. He started at the CSIR. We're focusing on water and effluent management. I was introduced to systems thinking and system dynamics in the early 90s and found a calling to it. In 1994, he found Dynamic Strategies, a company focused on solving complex problems. In 2007, the whole team joined Toyota South Africa, and they headed the design and construction of the new Toyota parts warehouse in Boksburg. In 2020, he headed up the construction project for phase 2 of the parts warehouse. He's a founding member of the South African chapter of System Dynamics and the 2020 president. He's also a visiting lecturer at the Department of Mechanical, Industrial and Aeronautical Engineering at the University of Witwatersrand. And he volunteers as an educational counselor at MIT and interviews applicants from South Africa and various countries in Africa. He's also a keen bridge player and Meccano collector. Andries, we're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Skalk. Yeah, I'm not going to start this off with a fight, so sorry, Corné. So basically, I work for Toyota South Africa full-time, and one of the questions I think we grapple with and the whole industry grapples with is, how do we move people away from the current model where we've got internal combustion engines? Just going, there we go. So I'll basically give you a background, talk a little bit about my method, talk about the results, a little bit of a discussion, and then finally the conclusion. So basically what we do know is if we burn oil or coal, there's always an emission, and the emissions can take the form of CO2 or carbon monoxide, which means the combustion is not complete, which is not ideal. Then there's also the nitrogen oxides that can come because of impurities in the fuel. And when I say fuel, it can also be coal or oil or petrol or whatever. And then there's also the sulfur impurities, sulfur oxides that can form. And of course, then there's also sometimes particulates, which is basically the non-combustible elements. Now, the first place where you find these is where we've got point sources. So, for example, a power station, smelter, a steel manufacturing plant, all of these are point sources where you've got large volumes of emissions that are generated, but they can be controlled at that source. And the advantage of that is that you can cover that with economies of scale. So you only need one system to take your flue stack and drive it through there. Then we get distributed sources, and that's where the transport system comes in, because the internal combustion engine, by its nature, burns oil or oil products, and we end up with CO2, CO, NOx's, SOx's. And if you look at the data, there's 30% of the emissions that are generated in South Africa come from the transport system. So what are the people in the transport system doing about this? From a vehicle manufacturer point of view, we've been working a long time with catalytic converters, and the purpose of the catalytic converter is simply to make the NOx's and the SOx's to be less harmful to the environment. When it comes to the CO2, CO situation, we try and make our vehicles as fuel efficient as possible. And that's why there's a lot of research over the years that's gone into fuel injection rather than carburetors, which is quite a bad way of burning petrol or diesel. And we've also, I mean, if you look at the engines these days, they are significantly more fuel efficient than they were 10 years ago. However, we need to move to the next step. And where do we go to? So our options there are, we can go with traditional hybrid. Traditional hybrid are something like the Prius, where the vehicle basically uses regenerative braking to charge a battery, but it's also got an internal combustion engine in there, which you will then use to charge the battery or drive the vehicle depending on the driving conditions. Plug-in hybrid is basically one where you can take it home tonight and you plug it into the electric socket and you charge your battery through that. It still uses regenerative braking, but the whole idea is that by being able to plug it in, you can reduce your need for petrol or diesel to drive the internal combustion engine. After that, and I think it's still a toss-up, are we going for electric vehicles or are we going for hydrogen fuel cell vehicles? I'm not sure, because I think it's, there's advantages to both, and we're busy exploring both of those. The final thing I want to talk about is how do we implement trying to get people to shift their behavior? Do we do it through a policy approach, or we do it through a change in behavior approach? So let's just look at some of our data. If you look at vehicle sales, and I deliberately started here in 1994 when we started formally generating the data sets, and what you'll see is very interesting. If you look at the line there that says petrol, you have 263,486 new vehicles that were sold in 1994, petrol-driven engines. Diesel was only 39,636. So basically only 1/10 or thereabouts of the vehicles at that time were diesel-driven vehicles. If we go to the next little block there, 2017, we're looking at the petrol vehicles sold 346,931. But if you look now at the diesel, 210,418, we basically now seen a shift where the diesel part of the mix has become more and more or bigger and bigger. And part of the reason for that is that the motor manufacturers have moved to more efficient diesel engines and diesel systems. But what you'll also see here is interesting is that our electric vehicles are starting to appear. We're also seeing some plug-in hybrid, but you can see the curve is not consistent. It drops down to by 2021, only 51 were sold. But then the interesting one is the traditional hybrids. It's been hovering around about 180. And then in 2021, it shot up to 627, and 2022 data is not complete yet, but we've probably 5 times that number already. And the reason for that is availability of hybrids, which for the first time we manufacture in South Africa. Now, if we look at how we go about making a decision when we want to buy a vehicle, it's very simple. You start off and say it is time to buy a new vehicle. You look at, do I have money? If I have money, I can now start with my process. And usually the first step is the brand. I'm going to ignore that for now, but basically saying that I can now start and look at a number of elements. Sorry, just turn. So my decision to buy the vehicle is basically drives the propulsion system, but I'm going to look at the relative price. If a diesel and petrol engine are about the same, then it becomes a toss-up. Then I can maybe look at what is my experience with internal combustion engines. Did my previous diesel engine work okay, or am I not happy with that? I can look at environmental factors. And then I also have to start looking at what is my experience with electric vehicles. Now, I can tell you my experience with hybrid vehicles. I was given a Prius to drive the first week I joined Toyota. At the first stop street, this thing died completely. There was no vibration, there was no noise, nothing. The dashboard was just lit up, but there was nothing. I think I pushed the on-off button about 7 times before I realized that if you just step on the petrol, this thing will move forward. And unfortunately, that's been such a bad experience. So I'm waiting for the next generation where at least they've got some engine noise that they can play in my ear from the speaker to make sure that I can understand how to drive the electric vehicle. So that's the first part we want to look at. The second thing I want to look at is how do we go through the selection routes when we decide which propulsion system to use. So, in the good old days, we were all talking about petrol rear-wheel drive petrol cars because they were the fastest, and they could corner, and you could spin, you could do all sorts of weird and wonderful things. Then we moved to front-wheel drive, and that diesel debate, I think this was initiated by the Volkswagen Golf when they first introduced a passenger car with diesel, because suddenly diesel became interesting. But there's still a switch. So some people will drive a diesel for a while, then switch back to petrol. For example, at the moment with the diesel prices going through the roof, we are probably seeing in the market, we're seeing more petrol vehicles being sold. And all I'm trying to demonstrate here is that this is a hugely complex diffusion type model where I can move from a diesel vehicle to a plug-in hybrid. I can move from the diesel to a EV. I can also get upset and move right back to petrol. There's no constraint that says you cannot move back to an alternative vehicle. So what I've tried to do in the simulation is to build a very simple, it looks like a population model because it is a population model. When we talk about a vehicle park, the vehicle park is basically the number of vehicles that's on the road at any point in time. And what is quite important here is that the life expectancy, because we have lots of information about the annual sales of vehicle, but how many of those vehicles are on the road at any point in time. And I've basically created this simulation, and trial and error calibration basically showed me that if I use a vehicle life expectancy of 20 years, then I get a number that is in line with the total vehicle park that is expected in South Africa. Just an interesting point here, you can also see how the petrol vehicle park is still predominant, but you can see how the diesel vehicle park is slowly but surely growing and beginning to catch up. The next section of my model focused on the mass diffusion. I'm just showing a small part here, but basically saying that we know that there's external. So we know that there's external factors that can affect the market growth, and that could be economic factors that reduces it. It could also be economic factors that drives it and improves on it. But then there is the switch that basically says, if I used to drive a petrol vehicle, I might find an incentive to swap to a diesel vehicle. But again, that's a buy flow, so the vehicles can go in or out of this vehicle park based on the decisions made by people. What I then did is, as I said, I put the whole complexity together, and at the moment I've only analyzed 2 scenarios, and I'll explain why I went there, and it's particularly around supply data. So the first option was, what happens if government policy says that all new vehicles must have a new propulsion system? So we're not allowed to manufacture or sell any diesel or petrol vehicles in South Africa. And the interesting line to look at is this blue line at the top, which is the total vehicle park. And what you're seeing here is that there's a drop-off in the vehicle park because the overall vehicle sales basically reduce. Reason for that is, we South Africans, if you tell me that I'm not allowed to buy a petrol vehicle and I've already got one, I will drive it until I've fully upset you, and only then will I make a decision to change that. I think one of the examples here is, of course, is our taxi industry, where some of those high aces that we manufactured in the 1980s, 1990s are still on the road today, and people just do not get rid of them. So this is the first scenario. The second scenario, I allowed the BAS curve to control what happens. And what is very interesting is, well, firstly is, yes, we maintain our market growth as to the expectation of the industry. The industry is very optimistic. So I'm not sure if the sales numbers they've got in mind will really realize, but I use their anticipated sale numbers. But what is very interesting for me is, although there's a slower uptake on the hybrid vehicles, the endpoint in this specific simulation compared to the previous outcome is actually higher, so that there is as the momentum gathers, and I think if anybody who understands or knows the BAS curve knows that once you go past that 10% market share, then the curve becomes irreversible. And in this particular case, we're seeing that in terms of hybrid vehicles. And of course, I have a lot more data on hybrid vehicles than on electric or, electric vehicles, because we just don't have that many in South Africa. So let's talk about the scenarios. So basically, if the government policy says switch to alternative populations, we're going to see a shrinking vehicle park. And then despite the policy, combustion engines will still remain significant number, even past 2050, when we want to have them all phased out. The scenario 2, where the total number of vehicles keeps on with the growth pattern, but then what I see is that the uptake of hybrid vehicles is faster under scenario 2. If I move to the conclusions, my model limitations is that there's no supply side information in here. And the dilemma with that is that people buy what's available. So if you want a hydrogen vehicle at the moment and you try and buy one in South Africa, it is impossible. It's not virtually impossible, it is impossible. And then secondly, the vehicles in South Africa stay on the road for a very long time. I think the global industry standard is about 13 years of a life cycle. In South Africa, we're looking at around 20. And then, of course, reaction to government policy may have unintended consequences, so that people keep their vehicles longer. And interesting is they also can then cause much more risky environment in terms of driving. And that's those old high-ace taxis I'm talking about. So the fusion, interestingly enough, is going to be driven by market forces. That means that we are likely to see a feedback loop to the supplier decisions, making decisions regarding which models to manufacture locally in South Africa, and then also which models to import. So, for example, Toyota South Africa has taken the leap. They're now manufacturing hybrid vehicles in South Africa. The Corolla Cross Hybrid is manufactured in South Africa. And if we sell those, then of course there's suddenly demand, and you can make the case to say we need to manufacture more of those and push that production, which then becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Success to the successful, we hope. And that is basically my presentation. I don't know if there's any questions. You're welcome to ask.
Thank you, Andries. Yeah, I just thought it interesting that I drive a Toyota Yaris that's 16 years old and it's still going all right. So I'm not sure whether it's good or bad in this case. Anyone else?
As long as you service it at a dealership, I am happy.
I am. Yes, no, I do service it at the Toyota dealership. Any other comments or questions?
I see Nalini has got a hand up.
Nalini, please ask your question.
Thanks for that presentation, Andries. In terms of the hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, do you also see any government discounts or any incentives provided to the consumers for purchasing it? And also in terms of like the import taxes, do you think that is something the government will look at for those particular vehicles to reduce?
Yeah, Nalini, it's a very good question. It is something that we are looking into, and we are in discussion with government. At the moment, it's not looking very positive. But from a pricing point of view, Nalini, that it's a difficult one. Government has definitely not come to the party yet. We do hope they will, but at the moment, there's no change in their attitude yet.
Thank you. Then Ram, it looks like you wanted to make a comment or ask a question.
Yeah, Ram, so this information is basically is based on there's data. I've got data on sales, and I basically use the behavior over the last number of years to estimate that. So I ignored scrapping rate at this point because of the age that we've got on our vehicles. So, yes, we do see about a 1% scrapping of new vehicles due to accidents and, being stripped for parts. But in the context of the vehicle age in South Africa, that is not such a big item for us. Yes, so the next version of the simulation I will not be able to share with you because that will be an internal project I'm doing within the Toyota brand itself, where we will be taking a much deeper understanding of this demand side, but also looking at the supply side and also looking at how our sales can potentially affect our mother company in terms of allowing us to bring in more alternative propulsion system vehicles.
And then just a comment from Sandor that it would be interesting to add emissions data where possible, since it could possibly influence future policy from an environmental perspective. Okay.
Absolutely. And that's part of phase 2 of this project.
No, very interesting. Okay, thank you very much, Andries.